We're here on page Yud Gimel. On the left side, we're up to Vlados Tmura, which is about 6 paragraphs down from the top, on the left side of Yud Gimel. Vlad HaRishon, Anolad Lebehemas Hatmura. Now, we said on many occasions that a Behemas Tmura has the identical status as the original animal. And the Chiddush of Tmura is that the Bailam are not able to transfer the Kedusha from the original animal, but we called it like cloning. And the second animal now has the same status of Hegdish as the first. Now, when we have a Behemoth Hegdish, the Vlad of Hegdish has the same status as its mother. And that we saw before with 2 different drushes that we had. So on an intuitive level, just without thinking, below the surface, just mathematically, the Vlad of a Tmura should have the same status as the Tmura. He says the following: Nechlaku bo rishonim nechshav kivlad Vlad. Now, what he's saying here, again, we'll see who the Rishonim are in the footnote, but what's more important to us is that the Tmura itself is called a Vlad, according to one Shita. Why? Because he wasn't Magdish the Tmura as an original Hegdish. So if we're calculating the differences between the original Hegdish and the Tmura's Hegdish, one difference is that the Tmura's Hegdish itself is called a Vlad. Even though physically, biologically, it's not a Vlad, it wasn't born to the first animal. Like both animals were alive simultaneously. But nevertheless, as far as Hilchas Kedusha is concerned, as Hegdish, the Kedusha of the Karban here, in the case of a Tmura, is generated by the original animal. So therefore, it becomes a Vlad. And therefore, when the Tmura itself gives birth to a Vlad, that Vlad becomes a Vlad of a Vlad. And we learned that according to at least the Shita Rabbi Elazar, a Vlad of a Vlad should not be brought on the Mizbeach. We have to lock it up until it dies. And he writes, Lefiyat Shatmura B'Atzma, he kivlad, Vlad Rishon, right? It's like a Vlad. Uvlada kivlad Sheni. That's one sheet in the Mishnah. Oh, here's the second sheet in the Mishnah. Gam Vlad HaTmura U Kivlad Rishon. Why? Because the Tmura itself is like an original Hegdish. And we're going to emphasize the biological element here, that there's no third generation here, it's only a second generation. So in the note here, he writes, Shitas Rashi. Well, this was before they got Frum. Now they got Frum. They won't write Reish Tzaddik Ches. No. Like Reish Ayin became Ayin Reish in all the books, but here he has it in the original. This was probably published before they got so Frum. Anyway, he says Shitas Rashi Shavlad HaTmura Kivlad Sheni. Which is good. I mean, that makes sense because the Tmura itself is like an original Hegdish. It wasn't born to Hegdish, it's a lot of Hegdish. So that second Shita here is actually the Shita Rashi in Masechta Tmura. Bagos HaGra Hiksha, Migir Sasenu b'Mishnah, Divrei Rabbi Shimon, Vlad Avlad, Cholok Mivlad Rishon, Yal Vlad Tmura. Apparently, we have a girsa in our Mishnah that seems to indicate that the Vlad of Tmura is a Vlad of Vlad. Got Vlad of Vlad shel Tmura nikra Vlad Sheni. Even though he used the word Vlad Sheni, what he means is Vlad of Vlad, and that's why it's called Vlad Sheni, because the mother is called the Vlad Rishon. Even though she's not really a Vlad at all, but she's considered like a Vlad. So apparently Rashi didn't have that girsa. However, he says other Rishonim, like the Shimon Betzes, Rabbi Gershon, had the Mishnah Vlad HaTmura, as if to indicate that the Vlad Tmura is like a Vlad of Hegdish, who can Pirush Rashi. Oh, so that's good. So we now have a different girsa that doesn't say Vlad Vlad Tvura, but rather Vladat, which means it's only one generation. Ukapirish Rashi Shavlad Tvura Kulo Shem. Meaning the Vladat Tvura is not called a Vlad Vlad, but rather it's called a Vlad. Okay, so that's interesting that we have two Girsos in the Mishnah. But it's interesting because although this paragraph seems harmless and somewhat secondary, it's like a footnote in the whole constellation. But really, if we were studying Tvura and looking at the entire overview and all the perspectives on Tvura, this would be a very important paragraph because you see, according to some Rishonim, Tvura is not really the same as the original Hegdesh, original animal that was Zebach Bath. And the nafkamina is going to be whether it has the status of a Vlad, which means that if it gives birth, the Vlad becomes a Vlad de Vlad. Again, that's not Rashi's Girsa, but nevertheless, it's a very fascinating Shita. And sets up Tvura as a different category of Hegdesh. Vlados ha'ola ve'osham utmuroseihem. Now, until now, we've been focused on Vlad Shlomim and Vlad Toda. And we came to the conclusion that although Vlad HaVlad is a machlokas tanoim, but the Vlad itself has the same status of Hegdesh as the original, and that's true in both Shlomim and Toda. Now we want to study Ola and Osham. Then we get to Chatas. Hifrish nekeva li Ola, Oli Osham. See, we have a little bit of a problem here. When we talk about Shlomim, then we can talk about a nekeva. Right? If we want to talk about Vladis, we must talk about a nekeva. But you could have a nekeva that was sanctified Shlom, but you can't have a nekeva that was sanctified neither for an Ola or an Osham. So how are you going to set up a Vlad of an Osham or a Vlad of an Ola? How are you going to imagine such a Metzius? You're going to have to assume that he went ahead against the law and he was mafish in a keva for either an Ola or an Osham. The Yolda. Okay, so he says we're gonna be studying in the next paragraph all the details about this case. You remember that we discussed the fact that when you're mafresh in a keva for an Ola or an Osham, it does get some sort of status of Hegdesh. Let's say he has a carbon Ola or a carbon Shlomim, or an Ola or a carbon Osham, and it's from a Zohar, obviously. And he does a Tvura onto a nekeva. Now this nekeva gives birth to a little sheep or a goat or a kid, right? We call it a calf. So mavur b'gemara sheba ofen shekreviv heim atzmam galo ahem yesh ligzar shelo yikrevu shem yigalo ben adorim. Okay, so we already encountered this halacha in the Shita Rebbe Lazar that Chachamim say, let's not allow him to be makriv a vlad of Kodshim, which Torah does require that you makriv it, because we're afraid that he's going to be busy breeding and creating a whole flock of animals, all of whom have the status of Hegdesh, and he might come to violate the Isur of Gizav Avod. Ach, Rambam, Tmura Perik Dalet. Kishitas hasover shebahem ein ligzor shema yigadol adorim vadorim shebaofen she'enam craven hem atzmam eliyiru ad sheyistavu v'rak dmeim craven lo gozru chacham. So the Rambam establishes a limitation, a restriction. When is there a shak, derabbanan, of Shemi Gadol Adorim? That's only if they're craving al gavi mizbeach. Dasaram, pasuk kishitas over. Bohem, I'm not sure what this word bohem. Bohem ein ligzor. Bohem is referring to three things. Because in the next line, in the next sentence, he says, "Ba'ofen she'enam craving atzmot." Maybe the word "bahem" is referring to that. Let's see. We have something that is in the status of Yira Achistoiv.
Because you can't bring it to the oil.
Because you can't bring it on the Mizbeach. Logos. It's almost as if to say that he's not going to propagate these animals, breed them, if he can't bring them on the Mizbeach. What motivates him here of Gadol Adorim is when it's Karvagam. And that's where we're going to have Zera, because of he's, leaving all these young animals around, and they're all hegdesh. We have a problem. He might come to violate Gizav Avot. That's only in a case, according to the Rambam, of craving b'fnei atzmo. Let's say, for example, you have a vlad of Kodshim, and it's craving b'fnei atzmo. That's not going to apply to an akeva in Ola v'Yashim, but let's say an akeva of Shlomim or a Zocha. The Rambam says if you can be makriv, then we have a problem. And Xer of Shevi got. But if Einam craved this neatzma, like the cases of an akeva, etc., and then the halacha becomes Iroach Yistavu, such a case, he's not going to be Megadol Adorim. Like he's not tempted here because the benefits don't care. He's not winning the lottery. He wants to propagate more Kodshim, so whenever he needs a carbon dove or whatever he needs, he has, he's got these animals that are Kodesh. But if it's not royal in his Bech anyway, it's Yirashat Shistoy, means in other terms it's not Karib B'fnei Atzmo, then there's no Gzera of Shema Yigadol Behem Adorim. So you don't need Misa. What you're going to do is you're going to wait until it becomes a Balmum, you're going to be poded, and then the Damim will be used and earmarked for buying a carbon sibel. It's in Olas Nidov. But that doesn't apply in a case where there's a Gzera of Shemi Yigadol Adorim, but that is limited to the case of something which is Karib B'fnei Atzmo. Oh, so in Ola we have another variable that will lead us to the conclusion that there's no Gzeira. And that's the case of an Ola. What's unique about an Ola? The carbon Ola Kulu Kolio Ein Bo Hanola Bailam in Loch Hashem Yigadol Adorim Adorim. If I understand correctly, what he's saying is that you're motivated to proliferate and breed the animal, which is Kodesh, in order to get more behemoth Kodshim, if A, it's going to be brought on the Mizbeach, meaning all these little vlados here running around will be carved. And number two, B, he will be able to enjoy some benefit from the carbon itself. So we're going to exclude now two different categories from this Gzeira that requires Nis, right? What are the two categories that will be excluded from the Gzeira? Either it's a case of Yirach Yistoy, which means it's not going to make it to the Mizbeach at all, because it will only lend itself to pigeon. And there's not going to be a Gzeira in the case of Ola because it's Kulo Kol. And then that's what we have so far. Again, with the case in Akeva, Leola, Leoshim, I think we have to wait until we get to that. But now we're talking about a Vlad of Chatos, Vlad Chatos Dina Lemisa, right? That's one of the 5 categories of Halacha Moshe Bisina. Vlad HaMaiser Utmuras. That's every 10th animal you have to designate as Maiser. That's called Maiser Behema. And what's the status of the Vlad of Maiser? What's the status of Tmuras Maiser? And again, we have to talk about an Akeva, because otherwise, when we, if you introduce the subject of Vlados, you have to talk about an Akeva. So you have a Vlad of a Maiser, which is Behema. Is Darshu Bo Chachomim in Masha Nemar B'Shlomim Im Kesev Umakriv. Chachamim Yidal. You have Yidal? No. See, that was, we got a little bit confused here. Because I think what John did yesterday was he photocopied the Iyun in the back. He did? So I didn't get that. I only got this one page. What he said? This is Megillah that I'm teaching. Daf. You're saying he did make a copy of Yidal. I only got Yidal. All right, so you know what? I'll just read a little bit more, then maybe we can take a break and photocopy it. Now, the word Kesev in this pasuk by Yikra Gimel pasuk Zayin is interpreted to mean a tleh. Now, apparently, we're talking about a Vlad. And he's bringing the Vlad, which is called a Tleh here in this. And all this is, I think, in Tmura Daf Yud Chesam and Beis. So the Chazal interpreted in the Gemara in Tmura that this Vlad is Vlad Shlomim. And the Torah says that Hu makriv. Makriv means it's karev al gabi mizbeh. However, this is called a mute. Why? Because the Torah says in kesev, if it's a vlad of a kesev, then he should be makriv. And that's a case of a vlad of shlom. And it comes to exclude the ein vlad kol kodshim karev. So it's a separate din in shlomim. Upirshu chachamim sheba hakosav l'mayit vlad maser she'eno karev.
The blood of Masa has to be a male or female.
It's got to be a female. Well, the vlad itself could be either a male or female, but it's a vlad on the female, obviously. And it's excluded from this halacha of karev al gabi mizbeh. So that's what he writes here. Pirshu chacham sheba kosel l'may vlad maser she'eno karev el yira ad sheyistayev. Now, normally when we apply the principle of Yirat Shemistayev, then we need a pidyon, because it becomes a balmum, and then we take the domim and we use it for a carbanola, etc., etc. But that's not true in the case of Maser. What happens is, if a carbon Maser becomes balmum, it becomes chulin automatically. We don't need to undergo a process of pidyon. And we shech the animal, we eat it like we eat any chulin. So in this case of a vlad, of a meiser, which we learned from the miyut that it's not brought on the mizbeach like the blood of shlomim, then we have a loch of yirat sheyistayev, and once it becomes a balmum, then it becomes chulin, and we can just shecht it and eat it as chulin. Then he has a case of vlad tmuras meiser, is kitmuras maser. Sheinu karev ev shiyochal b'mumo lebayla. And vlad tmuras bechor, vlad tmuras habechor kitmuras habechor sheinu karev el nechal b'mumo kidin bechor shenofal b'mumo. All right, let me give you this Gemara, and all you need is to make a photocopy of this one single page, which is Yudal. Do you mind doing that?
I don't have to use the machine.
All right, so I'll walk you through it. Time for Gemara. I'll just take a second to shut this down, if you don't mind.